Well, we are back for the sixth installment of Valley St. Louis Master Craftsman Study Group programs. Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge, Lesson 6. We're excited. Again, the normal caveats, make sure you've read all the material that leads into this prior to kind of going through this material as it is. Otherwise, some of this just isn't going to make sense. This is an overview. This is a high-level discussion, kind of hitting the main level points. There's going to be some incongruity to the discussion. We want you to succeed, but again, this is just kind of the highlight reel. So again, we're excited to have you here. This is a longer section. This section is going to be pretty aggressive, so keep that in mind. Last session was longer as well. This is a similar number of slides, a similar number of rabbits we're chasing. So let's get excited. Here we go. So we are moving through this very easily. Again, make sure you read the material. We are now up to lesson 6. That is the 3 grips, the substitute master's word, and a little bit of discussion on the faith of Albert Pike. All this kicks off with lesson 3, the 3 grips, and that's going to be on page 127. So make sure you're flipped to there. If you're in your books, if you're following along in that sense. We're going to try to move through this and hopefully pass on a few things. So really early on in this section, we see an image right on the faceplate, page 126, and it talks to us about the raising of the master by Giovanni Francesco Barbelli, who lived 1591 to 1666. The original is in possession of the Supreme Holy Royal Arch Chapter in Scotland. So this dates, of course, to Barberi's life, which is well before, generally speaking, large spread speculative masonry, well before the Master Mason degree. And of course, elements of this painting, elements of this sketch, shares some affinity, of course, with our own legends, our own practices. You'll notice some weird hand gestures, some tools involved, what looks to be a deceased body in a grave, some things like that. Very interesting painting. Very interesting indeed. The grips, of course, we're going to talk about relate to the Master Mason's degree, as well as the Fellow Craft and the Entered Apprentice degree, and the ceremonies involved. But Pike starts off again with a couple of his random comments, where he says that when I was raised, the impression made upon me was not one that elevated Masonry in my estimation. The performance seemed to me supremely absurd. And he talks about some of the things were said in regards to phrases like the strong grip, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he argues against some of the common thoughts that are used. Even today, I hear some of these used and associated with those comments. And he gives basically a very clear argument that, there was no explanation given to me of these phrases, and the arguments now used don't hold water. And he continues to talk about this fact that he believed the symbolism of that ceremony in some ways. He believed the symbolism of the craft lodge in general was undervalued. As he goes on to say that it occurred to me by and by that the inventors of masonry must have been men of more intellect and knowledge than the work seemed to indicate. They could not have perpetrated such absurdities and pluralities as what was meant in the literal reading and in the largest measure was consistent of. So Pike digs in. He follows some what he says were blind guides and make him no wiser, no deeper in his knowledge. He makes a couple discoveries that prove worthless. He tells us that he set his faith in the Egyptian origins of masonry. And it's actually important to note that the gentleman whose origins, who perpetuated some of these Egyptian ideas that Pike was following, later himself publicly dismissed those ideas. So he's trying to all these different angles to look at the 3rd degree, to look at the Master Mason's degree, the ceremonies of it, see if he can make sense of it in a symbolic nature. And again, he goes on his past master's rant. He talks not so much about the Master Mason degree at this point, but he talks at large about what people are saying about him, his efforts in masonry, the importance of symbolism, the importance of Masonic education. I'm a frequent proponent of the statement that Masonic education matters and make it a priority. Here, Pike is kind of getting to that. He talks about those who have misunderstood him and how they're the Sir Oracles of the order. They don't know what they don't know in Masonry doesn't matter. Pike talks about it. He talks about their disdain, their objection. Yet he will talk, and he reiterates the point that while they may have issues with him, he's met with thousands of brothers in lodges, grand lodges, other functions that have listened to him speak and thanked him for giving them light which they never had before. He continues this, just going on and on about it, hitting out at politicians and every level of Masonry beyond, talking about guys who went to the dizzying heights of Templarism, spurning everything behind them just so they were Templars. He elaborates on the fact that while Masons will say, well, we don't want to read, we don't want education, we don't want to dig into it, yet in front of farmers, educated men in grain lodges, small gatherings, he has spoke for never less than an hour with and a half, often 2 hours at large, and sometimes far longer, with brethren attentively listening, and nobody leaving unless they had to or were compelled by duty. So he's talking about the idea that there is a desire for education out there. There is a desire for understanding the ceremonies of Masonry out here. There are detractors against him. There are detractors against this idea of exploring Masonry, or those who just set it aside because they're too high. But he pushes this idea that, no, we need to keep digging. We need to keep pushing. And his conclusion is in my mind, just a beautiful statement. Masons are tired of straw and husk as intellectual diet. They are eager to learn. So let's see what he discovered when he was eager to learn and pass that on. The three grips themselves, Pike delves into quite beautifully, in my opinion. And he says that I do not believe the ceremony of raising was intended merely to inform the candidate that Masonry cherished a belief in immortality or continued existence after death in the human soul. And he points out that while we may say those things, that actually runs contrary to some of our doctrines and the men we admit as Masons in their faith practices. So, before we go into detail, the too long don't read version of the grips is that the grip of the entered apprentice represents science, the grip of the fellow craft represents logic, the grip of the master mason represents faith. Take a minute. Think about that. Process that. What does it mean to you? What symbolism can you see in that? If you need to stop, do so. Grab a drink, think on it. Grab a cigar if you want. Take a walk, but consider that relationship before we dig in. To begin this examination, to begin this consideration, Pike circles back to that concept of the immortality of the soul, the continuity of the soul. And he says, if that's supposed to be a big part of the lesson of this degree, if that's supposed to be a key point to it, how do we attain certainty of that lesson? How do we attain certainty of anything? And he talks about, as one who would doubt, where's our first turn going to be? Well, it's going to be to science, and that's probably where we're going to begin our inquiry. So he tells us that the science is like the entered apprentice grip. It sets us to examine. We use methods, we use instruments, we use processes, tried and true, that have been successful time and time again to try to prove this idea that the continuity of the soul exists. Yet, science is going to claim woe and defeat, filled with despair, because it can't prove it, and thus it fails. The fellow craft degree steps in as logic. And of course, Pike then goes on to talk about this idea that philosophers like Plato, Cicero, others have explored and argued the lessons of the universe, the processes of existence, and come to naught. For after studying the metaphysical works of many writers for years, I've closed them all, set them upon a shelf, and I've not opened them since. That's what Pike tells us. Because in his conclusion, we can have no certainty of anything. So, when logic discusses the question in regards to the human mind and the human soul, it has no place to stand upon. Science is the observation of phenomena to obtain certainty in regard to its existence. Logic argues from these causes and gropes the unknown for the invisible. Thus, logic fails on us, just as the fellow crafts grip. We're left then with the grip of the Master Mason, and it represents faith, because faith is a conviction of the intellect, our beliefs, our ideas, and it's engraved upon the mind by the finger of God, Pike tells us. And he lays out the importance of the abiding belief by man, no matter if they're the rudest savage or otherwise, that is brought forth by faith. And he codifies his belief on this idea, this symbolism, this understanding of the grips, this idea of science, logic, faith. He codifies it in his text, The Porch in the Middle Chamber, the Book of the Lodge, where he tells us in that text, and you can purchase this text from the Scottish Rite Research Society. It is freely available now. The raising of the body of Hurum symbolizes reascension of the immortality of the soul. This can neither be proven by the inductions of natural and physical science, the apprentice grip, nor demonstrated by the process of the logic of metaphysics and philosophy, the grip of the fellowcraft, but is only established by the wise and analogies of faith, the irrefutable convictions of consciousness, which are the lion's grip. That is the lion of the tribe of Judah. To the Christian grip, these three grips are symbolic of pagan philosophy, Hebraic materialism, and Christianity. And Pike ends with that little bit there. I think that's an interesting concept that he notes. Again, he likes to present us with symbolism, and then he likes to tie it through other lenses. So, again, what are the three grips symbolize? What is this third lesson we learn of in esoterica? It's the idea that three grips represent science, logic, faith. And through that process of that raising, through that process of the ceremony of a brother being raised to the sublime degree, he moves through those processes to confirm what proves that immortality of the soul. So, with that, brethren, we're now going to move to the fourth lesson, the substitute for the Master's word. And brethren, I'd like you to just take a second, get a stretch. We're going to dive into this one. We are chugging along through this. So take a moment, and we'll get into this in just a second. Hope you're excited. Okay, so let's dig into the substitute of the Master's word. So that begins on page 140 in the text. And we see very early this image from L'Ordre de Franc-Maçon Tahi, 1745, in which the true word, we're told, is displayed upon a coffin in the plan of the lodge for the third degree, our text tells us. So interesting, worth your consideration to look at that image. There's some really neat symbolism to this image that I really like. And I'll leave it at that. I would encourage you, again, look at your text. So, what do we know about the Mason's word, the Master's word, and its substitute? The Mason's word of the 17th century was given to the apprentices. Was it? Pike didn't know. And of course, afterward, the name of deity for the Hebrews was adopted. Perhaps this is based in one tradition or another. It is noted that this ceased to be communicated when the Master Mason's degree was developed. We're unsure if that was true or not. There's a lot of things in the wind to that. Of course, we have a lot of layers to this discussion, a lot of things that are worth consideration and worth our time to kind of pay attention to, just because this is such a loaded topic. So, of course, in this section of the work, Pike does take some time to kind of go over the history within the Masonic realm of the Hieramic legend in regard to the word, the Master's word, that type of thing. And he says, there is no Master Mason now living who's ever received the true word in a Master's lodge. I was told, as we all are in this country, that it had been agreed by those who were present, that when the body was found, Solomon expressed his fear and in a peculiarly emphatic manner made a new word, and that the word was lost forever to me At least it seemed an unreasonable and probable story. That whole account is on 141 and 142. I would take some time to read through all of that, just as Pike kind of pushes you through the idea. Of course, per General Preston Webb ritual, per what we can dig through our own exposés and other public listed monitors, their statement by the kings, by the Grand Masters, is that the word is lost and there's no ability to recover it, and it's not been possible for centuries. Pike hits at the improbable nature of this entire scenario. He notes that if this word only needs 3 people to convey it, if it's so important, that's a real big pain anytime it needs to be said that Hiram, the king of Tyre, has to leave Tyre and travel to Jerusalem just so that it be done, or vice versa. And he feels, at least from Pike's perspective, that this agreement is absurd. Thus, he determines that the statement that the 3 have to be present is inevitably holding a concealed meaning, concealed significance. So, looking to this idea of the name of the divine as it was used in various forms, he goes toward the Hebrew spelling, which he notes contains 3 words, 1 repeated, totaling 4 characters. We have the Yud, which is the equivalent of an IYJ. Think Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, as I said in an earlier discussion. Hey, which would be RH, and Vav, which is equivalent to U, F, or V. So you have Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So those are the letters of the ineffable word of the Hebrew faith used within that scope, as is discussed within the lens of Pike's exploration. Of course, the Hebrew alphabet today is not the same as it was in ancient usage. Samaritan, of course, precedes it, being a modification of Phoenician. Hence, if you look at older Scottish Rite text, older symbols, 9 times out of 10, they're going to have probably Phoenician characters on it, maybe some form of Samaritan characters, not outright Hebrew, as Pike tended to think those Proto-Hebrew characters would be much more proper. And in those languages, the letter Yud actually shows up looking more like an M, which I think is interesting, and you would draw your attention to it by the idea of if it represents the divine, this idea of the Trinity, or 3 is 1, 1 is 3, things like that. In symbolism, it is an M, so it has 3 prongs coming into 1. Kind of an interesting thing to consider. Generally, of course, the name of the divine, as we would look at it through the Hebrew lens or various other lenses, is not really a name, but it's more relating to the essence of a divine individual, or its potency. Remember that God is not really a name. It's just kind of a cross species use, if you will, of placeholder. And in fact, God comes from the German Gut, so that's only been around since German modified itself to that point. So Pike keeps those things in mind. He begins to examine some of the letters and their relationship, their symbolism in the ineffable name, because that seems to keep getting drugged back to the fraternity. And he comes up with nothing in a general sense that is known to express the divine in relation to that ineffable word, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So Pike elaborates that it's possibly, and what hasn't occurred to most of us who've searched for the meaning and symbolism of this tetragrammaton as Masonic word, and its substitute word, could be all about perspective. And not so much what maybe the Hebrew priests or rabbis believed at the time of Solomon, but what those in 1723 to 25 believed, who created the Master Mason degree, who were perhaps Kabbalists, Rosicrucians, scientists, Renaissance thinkers in one way or another, and they considered its connotations. This leads us, of course, to some discussion on the Kabbalah, where we talk about the Sephiroth, which are representations of the divine emanations. Here you see just a quick example of the tree of life, where they all flow out and downward or upward, as you may decide to look at it. Of course, there are 3 primary pillars. We can trace that back to the idea of the supports of a lodge. three sports of a lodge, and we'll find some equal symbolization, some equal ground there in the ideas of sports of a lodge being wisdom, strength, and beauty, as well as the tree of life and what each one of those pillars, if you will, stands for. Now, let's consider an important aspect of the ritual. Of course, Pike hints at the fact, well, why can't this word be communicated except in certain circumstances? In part, this idea of when we three are present, as he notes. What's the significance of that? What does your reading tell you? What do your thoughts tell you on that? Consider perhaps what the three rulers, the three Grand Masters, represented when we connect them to the ideas of the Kabbalah, to the tree of life. What do their attributes symbolically represent? What do they stand for? Do they represent perhaps one of the letters of the Hebrew name of the divine, one of the Tetragrammaton's letters? How does that play into this? Of course, Pike then takes a little bit of a jaunt off in some other exploration. He talks about Hermes Trismegistus, that's Hermes the thrice great, of course, who is known for so much Hermetic thought, if you will, named after him in a way. And of course, there's a big discussion about Hermes over a page or so, where we're told in the Arcanum that Hermes was one who so clearly taught that the mystery of the Most High Holy Trinity ought to be adored, as well as the plurality of persons as unity in divine essence, if there was hypostasis. And of course, he existed long before. We're told he flourished before Pharaoh. He, of course, produces the Emerald Tablet, which has that beautiful line of that which is below is like that which is above. And we'll talk more about the Emerald Tablet later. But key to this thought, of course, is that he taught the existence of only one God, immortality of the human soul, or at least that's how Pike lays it out for us. He does compare Hermes' thoughts and discourses to those of Thoth in Egyptian mythology, and ties that through several other things within the idea of thou art begotten, though the unbegotten, the intellect thinking, the Father creating, God ever giving, the God making all things. Of course, that in itself should bring some tones back to when we discussed very briefly the introduction to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, etc., etc. Pike continues, of course, a couple of his off-kilter rabbit hole chases, discussing some of the Trinitarian ideas in Masonry and where they relate to the fraternity. Of course, among those things that are tied into this is the Mason Charter, which contained the Statutes of 1670 of the Lodge of Aberdeen, which in particular notes that the might of the Father in heaven, the wisdom of the glorious Son, and the grace and goodness of the Holy Ghost, the three persons in one Godhead, be with us in our beginning. He's tying all this to this idea of unity as above, so below, but also an interrelated Trinitarian nature of one is three, three is one. Some of that equal ground concept there in that sense. Of course, he then takes that statement and he says, well, these divine potencies in time can change. They were later styled the supports of the lodge and became symbolic of the character of the universe. So wisdom replaced might, strength replaced wisdom, beauty replaced grace and goodness. And of course, all this ties together with this idea of the law of love, which was taught by the teacher of Nazareth. So that's his crazy digression where he kind of talks about the Trinitarian nature of certain symbols and things. He talks a little bit about Hermetic thought, and then he circles back in pursuit of the word. So after I abandoned the attempt to ascertain the meaning of the substitute word, it occurred to me in regard to the use of a word often known as one of the old substitute words, mak benak, that perhaps the reason why I could find no meaning in it was that I divided it into three syllables, mak ben ak. Dividing it into makba nak, I found the meaning readily enough. But it did not for a long time occur to me to apply the same method to the substitute word. Of course, this substitute word, mak benak, long history in exposés, that type of thing. Brother Albert Mackey himself proposed that the substitute word meant, "What is this, the builder?" Pike said that doesn't make any sense. Is it a phrase? It's not a name. Why adopt that to be used as replacing the name of the divine? He jokingly suggests that, well, why wouldn't we say, "Lord, what a stench"? Do that in Hebrew instead. That'd make more sense than a word that doesn't even really work out. Additionally, Mackey's explanation destroys the symbolism with 4 syllables, not 3, and it destroys the repetition of the triads and the degrees. Also, of course, is alluded to the grammatical framing of the word. The word itself would not have existed in Hebrew during Solomon's time. Pike kind of finishes his reference with the explanation of marrow in the bone. He feels that that's the meaning behind it. And he says, at least it sounds like the word. And he contends that the meaning perhaps of that statement, while not bright and flashing, if you will, in neon, is perhaps related to the idea of the divine word in the universe. So, what is the true word then? Well, we've already discussed it. We've already alluded to it several times, at least in the sense of this text as described in this text. It is the Hebrew name of God as existent, representative of the Pateragnostos, the unknown Father, the invisible God, who reveals himself through the Word. That's what Pike comes to in his conclusions. Now, again, jumping around the world, Pike then kind of takes us back in the text, back to Hermes Trismegistus, and this time to the Emerald Tablet, after he's talked about this idea of the true word. And we're told that Alexander the Great discovered Hermes' tomb near Hebron, and in it was a tablet containing 13 sentences in Phoenician. The first was a statement that makes clear the truth of the document. The second statement was, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, for the purpose of making complete and perfect unity. Consider that phrase. What meaning does that have to you? It's a little bit more drawn out than the as above, so below, but I think there's some beauty to it, even in that sense, worth our consideration. The third statement informs us that as all things were produced by the one word of one being, so all things were produced from the unity by adaptation. It is the Father of all perfection throughout the world is the fifth. And these things go on and further discuss those points, which you can see within that lesson as they discuss more of Hermes Trismegistus. So that concludes our discussion on lesson 4. There's quite a bit of good information in that section. I would highly encourage you take some time to dig into it deeply. Take some time to really give it your full attention, make some notes, do some exploration. It's worth your time. I find that to be one of the more interesting concepts and discussions in general. So the next section that we're going to discuss and complete our material for the 6th lesson of Symbolic Lodge is the Faith of Albert Pike. And this begins on page 299. It's in Appendix 4, page 299. And again, with these extra sections, we kind of hit on the highlights and lead you to where we go through it. Pike, of course, has been accused of a multitude of things. We know this across the board, whether it's being an atheist, a worshiper of Satan, a messenger of Satan, every other dirty little thing you could think of. But the truth is tad off in many ways. To be clear, it's definitely not the case. We know he was not an atheist, and at least to our best guess and understanding, no devil worship. It is reasonable that we can, through a study of morals and dogma, through a study of his text, see some of his religious thoughts, as well as how he addresses other faiths and the relevance of his faith to him and to other men. Pike writes beautifully in Morals and Dogma, of course, in the 18th degree, where he describes the teacher of Nazareth, and he talks about the the lessons and the background and the interactions that occurred there. And he does it in such a beautiful way, that you see he has affection, but he also understands how to reasonably explain something in a way that is appealing to all. Whatever higher attributes the founder of the Christian may have faith have in our belief, have had or not had, none can deny that he taught and practiced pure and elevated morality, even at the risk and the ultimate loss of his life. As a lover of all mankind, laying down his life for the emancipation of his brethren, he should be to all, to Christian, to Jew, Mohammedan, an object of gratitude and veneration. Now, what surrounds Pike's relation to religion in a lot of ways and pops up with some for objection is his thoughts on the term creative principle, in regards to the Scottish Rite in general. And because of his reaction here, that's been construed elsewhere. Of course, his openness to other faiths and examining them has also brought him negative heat. But in 1875, there was an international congress of Supreme Councils held in Lausanne, Switzerland. Pike had called for the event for years. It didn't happen. And then when it did happen, the Southern jurisdiction did not attend. Inevitably, what happened as a result was there were a group of Supreme Councils that were involved that pushed for a change in the Grand Constitutions. The Southern jurisdiction would not support this change. They wouldn't endorse it. Pike got very heated about it. He reacted very strongly. He wrote letters to Grand Commanders around the world, arguing against this idea of a creative principle or a principal creator. These liberal Supreme Councils, as they were called, at least in certain texts, wanted to substitute the word God for this other title. Pike said that he believed it would destroy the right, and he reiterated the United States Masonic standpoint, this idea that you have to have a belief in a free supreme being, that the approach taken by these councils was unacceptable. It abandoned a personal God. It abandoned the ideas perhaps of Christianity in that frame, and it had no meaning. And he says it was demanded by an insignificant number of Masons in a single country. And he's referencing France. It originated out of France. So he ends this point with saying that to accept this in lieu of a personal God is to abandon Christianity and the worship of Jehovah and return to the wallow in the styes of paganism. So you can kind of get his approach to faith. I think this shows his belief, his train of belief, his train of ideas, but it also shows his standing that he felt that shifting to this term would open the door to some other potential issues across the board. And he felt that the stance that was taken, the stance that did exist, was reasonable, was effective, and was proper. By 1890, a year before his death, he spoke to the Masonic Veterans Association, and he spoke about the phrase, "I put my trust in God," stating it was the first profession of faith of each and every Mason made publicly in the craft. He said then, let all of us, in whatever affliction, adversity, hold fast, lest losing this trust, we should thereby cease to be Masons. And as all the Masons of the Obedience of the Grand Orient of France did when they expunged it from their ritual and invited the avowed atheist to seek initiation into its lodges. So very clearly, he's not a fan of atheism. He very clearly calls out the Grand Orient of France here, noting that by having our trust and our faith into the divine, in a supreme being, in God, however you may see that, we are bound together. We are stronger than those who seek that other path. And he goes on to continue his thoughts very plainly and clearly. Now, of course, Pike existed in a time of great change, modernization, scientific discovery, and thoughts on the world and its existence grew and grew. And he addresses that. He talks about it, and he looks at it from different perspectives. At least in one place, talking about some of those great sciences, Darwin included, and calling them the high priests of science who have displaced theologians. But theology deals with questions entirely beyond science. And he tells us that Freemasons should eschew idle babble of science that seeks to dispense with God, for he says that simple faith that we hold is better and wiser than the vain philosophy and self-confidence science. So Pike endorses the pursuit of knowledge, doesn't have a problem with it, but does see the idea of just setting everything aside for science as not a wise decision at all. So with that, my brothers, this concludes the sixth sixth lecture of Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge. We appreciate you joining us, being a part of this. We just have one more discussion left, and that will capstone all of this. So thanks for being a part of the evening, morning, day, afternoon, wherever you are. Remember, Masonic education matters, and have a good one. Thank you.